Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Dan Bogart. Hello, Dan. How are you doing?
I'm fine.
I am great, Dan. Dan, so we're going to be talking about your research on transportation, and then in the latter half of the interview, we're going to discuss specific papers. Dan, was transportation crucial to the Industrial Revolution in England?
Yes, definitely. By lowering transportation costs, it led to more integrated markets, provided incentives for entrepreneurs to innovate, allowed firms to get bigger, allowed more specialization across regions within Britain and also between Britain and the rest of the world. So it definitely was a important contributing factor.
Dan, tell us about Turnpike Trust. What's that?
What is that? Yeah. So that was you could call it a financial / institutional innovation in public finance. And what it was specifically was an organization that had the right to levy tolls, to borrow against the revenues of tolls, and undertake road improvements in a specific area. And it was created to deal with this perceived problem of poor maintenance of roads by existing authorities, which at that time were parishes who had been given the authority to maintain roads by the king centuries before the 1700s. But the problem for the parishes is that they didn't have the fiscal devices to really maintain the roads. So they really only had property taxes to rely upon. And they really couldn't easily coordinate with other parishes who might also want to improve the road. So the solution for this was to create an organization that had different fiscal powers, that is to levy tolls, and that could coordinate road improvements over a wider area, say all the roads leading into a major town or a highway that connected two major towns. You could coordinate the investments on that road with the Turnpike Trust. So that's why it was innovation in Britain at that time.
And then, comparing England to other countries in Europe at the time, what exactly led to the serious improvement in transportation infrastructure in England other than institutional innovations? And why couldn't other countries follow suit at the same time?
Okay, right. So it's a complicated question. It probably has many different answers to it. I mean, one would be, we think of a demand for infrastructure, and the demand in England would definitely be higher because of its higher income and its growing economy, industrial economy in particular. So England had a greater need for infrastructure. The capital markets in Britain were probably more efficient. So organizations like Turnpike Trust that existed could more easily get capital to build roads. But then I think aside from those two, there still is that the institutional background that was there, that you could create an organization like a Turnpike Trust, and you could create often very detailed rules about who should pay and how these organizations could be governed. So the ability to create organizations like that seems to be, I don't know if it's unique to England, but it seems like that economy was very effective in creating organizations, which in some of my writing, I've thought of as something akin to a public-private partnership today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Dan, I've often noted in private discussions and sometimes and also in public discussions that the British, they set the standard for institutional development.
Correct. And it ends up being, what's interesting about it's a path, the institutional path that Britain takes, which is creating organizations to provide key services. I could give you many examples of that besides the Turnpike Trust.
Give more, please do.
Okay. Another example would be what was called a town improvement commission. So there would be for example, there might be a problem in a city about how would the waste or the garbage be collected and taken away. How would they raise taxes to do something like that? There wasn't in the law at that time a clear way of doing that, and the existing municipal authorities didn't have the fiscal power necessarily to raise taxes for expanded urban services. So they created commissions called town improvement commissions, and their job was to provide new services. So that's another example. I should add to you, though, that these organizations were not perfect. Okay, a potential problem was that they could be run by a particular interest group for that interest group, right? So they weren't necessarily always thinking about the public good. So a complicated version of this story is that there still needed to be either competition between these organizations or regulation to try to direct them toward services that were beneficial to the public as a whole. Now, that succeeded in some cases more than others. Right? A third organization that you could introduce into this would be something like the East India Company, which is normally not thought of as the most benevolent or beneficial organization in the world economy, of course, because it's associated with colonization in India. But nonetheless, it is another example of an organization that's created in a partnership with the government to achieve some goal, in that case, to expand trade between Britain and Asia at that time. So what makes England different is its ability to create these organizations and to foster their development. Now, not every country follows that path. Arguably, the United States follows that path, creating organizations. So that's another side of the story, what happened in the US. But then in other parts of Europe, the state plays a more direct role in providing services, relying a bit less on organizations to do that. So this is not a path that's followed by every economy going into the 1800s and 1900s.
Dan, I like your research, but I must pose this question. Why study transportation?
Okay, so transportation is first in an important sector. The transportation governs the cost of moving goods and the cost of moving people. It also influences the cost of communication. So if we kind of enlarge those concepts, those are basically trade and communication costs, which are really fundamental to how an economy operates. So one reason is that transportation costs are essential to thinking about economies. The second reason is that transportation has been a sector where government has been involved, either directly providing the services or, like I was just discussing, supporting organizations. And so I like to study transportation for those two reasons. It's an important sector, and it also provides a lens to understand how government and laws and political systems had a practical impact on the economy, not an abstract impact, a very practical impact. You can ask the question in any society, who provided the roads? Who picked up the garbage, right? And who moved people? How did people move around, and what was the infrastructure? If you look at that question, you can see a lot of the ways in which the society operates.
All right.
That's why.
Yeah, transportation is crucial to development, Dan, but not okay, I should not say not many, but not as many as we would like are interested in studying transportation. It's one of those topics in economics that people tend to avoid. They only really talk about transportation when they want to score political points.
Right. Well, it gets, I mean, there's some details that to transportation that are, maybe less exciting to people. So for example, if you want to talk about railroad economics, there's lots of concepts like the load factor, similar with airlines, the load factor, how many seats are filled on the plane or how much cargo is shipped in the train. Some of that, it may seem a bit mundane, but I don't know, it's an example of studying the more nuanced aspects of economics in an economy. So I would encourage people to look into the details of something in economics, whether that's healthcare, whether it's transportation sector, whether that's education. At some point, we want to understand what's going on. We have to get into the details.
Yes, yes, exactly,
Yeah.
Dan. But
The
we're
devil
still,
is in the expression. The devil is in the details. So sometimes one has to go into the details to understand how things work.
but we're, s-
So
but we're,
that's
we're,
necessary.
we're still talking about transportation. So this is the follow-up question. In 2009, you wrote a paper titled Turnpike Trust and Property Income, New Evidence on the Effects of Transport Improvements and Legislation in 18th Century England. You can just shed some light on this paper for us.
Okay. This paper was asking, well, so I explained earlier what the Turnpike Trust
Yes.
was, this innovation in the financing of roads. And the question here was, did this innovation generate income gains? And particularly, might it explain why one area was more wealthy or had higher income than another? And so you can think about, well, what about labor income, maybe property income, maybe capital income? Those would be the three areas of income in general. Infrastructure typically raises property incomes primarily. So infrastructure in a local area should raise property incomes in a local area. So therefore, I thought, okay, that's the most natural way to understand if the Turnpike Trust increased incomes in a local area would be to look at property income. So I dug into the details and got measures of property income across space, and I could determine which places had Turnpike Trust and which didn't. And I started to ask just the basic question of, was income higher in places that got a Turnpike Trust? And I was able to answer, yes, it was. I think the estimate was that income was around 25% higher in places that had a Turnpike versus those that did not. So Turnpike Trust played a role in creating, differences in income across space.
All right. Now,
Yeah.
Dan, this is what we really need to talk about. Earlier, you mentioned the English East Indian Company, and some time ago, you wrote a paper, Monarchs, Institutions, and the East Indies Trade, and your co-author is Marco Del Angel. Dan,
Yes.
in what environment will not transportation revolution, but in what environment will infrastructural developments do well in the context of the monarchy? Because this is the question that you're seeking to answer in the paper.
So what role does the monarch play in the development of infrastructure, specifically East India Company?
Yes.
Okay. So and this is ongoing research that I'm involved in with Marco Del Angel. We're trying to understand what drove investment in East India Company. And we are trying to think about all East India companies in theory. We'd like to know the French East India Company, English company, Dutch company, because many Western European countries had their own East India Company. And they all had varying degrees of success. And by success, I mean market share in the Asian European trade. And what underlined their success in the European Asian trade, a lot of it was their ability to move goods. One of the primary functions of these companies was to move silver or manufactured goods from Europe to Asia, and then in Asia to use that to purchase tea and pepper and textiles and bring them back. So having a well-developed shipping capacity was important to that expansion. So we're asking the question of what role do the monarchs play? And the monarchs are arguably important because they are giving the charters to set up these companies, and they're giving them privileges like monopoly. And so the monarch's support for the company, just narrowly on their privileges, will alter the incentives to invest in the company. So simply put, if you have a monarch who gave you a charter and that monarch couldn't commit to honor the terms of the charter, or couldn't commit to a tax rate that maybe they agreed to with the company in advance, that would undermine the incentives to invest in the company. And so we are interested in how maybe some monarchs were able to commit better than others, and therefore influence the evolution of these companies. So that is the goal of that research.
Yes, and you also know that this is ongoing research. So are you planning to improve the research or revisit the thesis?
Yeah, so what we are revisiting it and trying to broaden our perspective. So we still have that goal of trying to explain the expansion and capacity of these companies, but we are thinking about what role geopolitics played. At this time, Europeans are engaged in all kinds of wars with one another, and those wars often had spillover effects on these companies. Famously, I'll give you an example of that. The French company and the English company were fighting with one another over control in parts of India, and their fight to control India was influenced by war events in Europe. And when war would break out, the navies and the armies would sort of help the companies or partner with the companies against the other. So we're trying to understand how these geopolitical events played a role in the success of these companies, as well as the nature of their domestic political institutions, which is what we were thinking about with the monarchs. What type of monarch do you have? How constrained might that monarch be? But now we're trying to broaden it to also think about geopolitics. And we're doing that because we think there's a bigger story to tell, maybe a bigger lesson to be learned.
Of course, there is. And your future research will be innovative and revolutionary because more people are studying the interplay between the monarchy and development. And I've actually written on the topic. So I'm guessing that we would like to know if there's a relationship between a monarchical government and transportation investment, or the quality of said investment.
Right. So it would. That's the question we would like to be able to answer, right? So we're trying to get there. We're not quite there yet, and being able to say something definitive. So
yes,
but it's ongoing research.
Yeah, and quite compelling research. When you read a lot of economic publications, you end up thinking like an economist. I didn't study economics.
Okay.
But in the abstract, you write, the latter suggests that monarch changes mainly shocked the English company, and that not all companies in the East Indies trade. More broadly, our evidence shows that the effects of monarchs differed greatly across institutional environments, and they mattered much less in the context where monarchs were constrained. Could you expound on this for us, please? Just make it a bit clearer.
Sure. So in a context where the monarch is the most important political actor, I'll use the term a case where they have almost near absolute power, or there are a few checks and balances in that society. In that case, it matters a lot whether the monarch is supportive of the company or not, right? If in France, for example, when various kings from Louis XIV to Louis XVI, when they turned their back on the French company, it was very hard for the French company to succeed. France at that time was a society where the monarch had a tremendous amount of power, in particular over big trading companies that were originating and working around Paris, right in the center of the economy. But you can go to other places where the monarch was more constrained, where parliament played a greater role, or where the courts had could make interpretations of the law, not necessarily at the direction of the monarch. In those cases, the monarch mattered less. Other things mattered, right? As well, or more. So you start to see maybe the monarch in a country like Britain, maybe they turn their back on the company at some point. But since they're not the central actor in that economy, there's other parts of the political system that play a role in regulating the company. They might not have such a big influence. So that's one of the arguments that we're trying to explore, is like, under what kind of institutional arrangements will the executive be crucial or central, and what kind of institutional range might they be more of a secondary factor?
Now we're going to move on to explore your classic paper, Infrastructure and Institutions, Lessons from History. I think it should become a classic. And I am interested in this paper, Dan, because I'm from Jamaica, the Caribbean. And although there is a positive association between infrastructure development and economic growth, this association does not appear to be universal. That's why I'm interested in your paper. In Jamaica, we have built bridges, roads, and as an economist, you should know Jamaica is like the poster child for low economic growth.
Right. So a crucial issue, I think, in infrastructure that's sometimes gets maybe ignored, is that we have to think about where is it placed, not just how much of it there is in the economy, and then we have to also think about how accessible is it to the population. If it's priced, for example, what is the price that is being charged to use the infrastructure? And that can matter greatly, especially in a poor economy, right? So what I'm interested in that paper is to sort of try to understand better why there are different, or I'll call them infrastructure outcomes. And I'm not just talking here about more or less infrastructure. I'm also talking about how it's priced, as I just said. So can we try to explain a situation where infrastructure is expensive versus cheap? So to answer those kind of questions about why do we see different infrastructure outcomes, I argue in that paper that institutions are central to understanding that. Okay. And institutions is a very broad, I've used that term a few times already, but it's the idea of, what are the rules that govern society, both formal and informal? How are they enforced? Okay. And then how does that then translate into something like infrastructure, or more generally development outcomes? Now, institutions are so broad that you have to narrow it a bit to understand what's going on. So in that paper, I say, let's focus in on democracy, the extent of democracy, and ask, how does democracy impact infrastructure? How much is there? How is it priced? And so on. So that's the argument of that paper, is that we should see institutions as perhaps a fundamental determinant of the infrastructure that's developed. And then to get to your point, why it may, in some cases, not really lead to development. It depends. And I'm saying it depends on the institutions, ultimately.
Well, institution, that's the word that you employ in your paper, but I think we should talk about political heuristics, because I read your paper and they're basically arguing that infrastructure developments occur within a political economy. So for example, middle class people versus poor people. If politicians are motivated to acquire the votes of middle class people, they may invest in infrastructure in places where it is not necessarily needed.
Correct. So so when I think about, so they're with this idea of institutions and maybe, to your point, like power and interest, right? You can think about middle class and poor. And so middle class and poor will have different interests in an economy. And what I think what's crucial in institutions is who has more say in the political process, the middle class or the poor. And you can imagine that being tilted in different directions. And so that's the idea. Okay, you can have in different societies greater voice for the middle class or greater voice for the poor. And the idea is you'll get different outcomes as a result.
And that's you right. Now, if the franchise is tilted towards the rich, then political actors are more likely to raise taxes, cut social spending, or borrow to pay for infrastructure. But if the franchise is balanced between the rich and the poor, political representatives may spend less on infrastructure to save taxes, limit borrowing, and spend more elsewhere.
Yes, it's possible.
Yeah, I'm just sharing this with our audience. And
Yeah.
in the paper, you also
I think the key thing in that, yeah, can I just elaborate on that point a bit? The idea there I was trying to make is that you can think about infrastructure versus, say, social spending. So maybe spending on schools versus spending on roads. And it's possible that the middle class prefers more of a mix between roads and schools, where the poor might prefer much more tilted to schooling. So who has power? Who has greater voice is arguably then going to influence how much infrastructure there is versus other types of spending. That was the point I was trying to make there.
Yes,
It's not an absolute that the poor would prefer more social spending to infrastructure, but I was putting that out as a general tendency.
and you're correct. It is a general tendency. I did not read this particular study, but I am familiar with the economist Naf Ziegler, and you cited one of his studies in your paper, and this is the result. The major finding of interest here is that greater peasant representation in 1903 was associated with higher spending on education, health, and administration, but it was not associated with higher road spending, and he's referring to Russia.
Yes. So he and Nafziger has this wonderful paper about how at the local level in Russia, at times the poor actually had a lot of say in government. And it's a period in the late 19th century after the abolition of serfdom. And for various reasons, the voice of the peasants or the former serfs was greater in some places than in others. And so what Nafziger did is then he said, well, how does the spending patterns of the local governments differ depending on whether you had more voice to the peasants/serfs versus the middle class or the landowners? And they find this kind of striking pattern that the more voice to the peasants and the serfs is a lot more spending on social items like education. So I took that as one example of this link between who has voice and what type of spending, and in particular what kind of infrastructure would develop in that economy.
And you also introduce us to the parallel of Kenya, and during that period Kenya was not necessarily democratic. And you right, following independence in 1963, Kenya had democratic institutions and with a government led by the ethnic Kikuyu. Then starting in 1970, it had a period of autocratic institutions, one led by a Kikuyu leader and one by a Kalenjin. This was followed by a return of democracy in 1993, and like before, one government was led by the former and the next by the Kikuyu. Kenya's governmental transitions provide a unique context to estimate the effect of democracy versus autocracy on infrastructure spending. The authors then assume that under democracy, leaders are constrained in the degree to which they can target. Therefore, to stay in power under democracy, infrastructure will be distributed more evenly across ethnic groups. And Kenya is a diverse country. I'm familiar with the Kikuyu. The Kikuyus, and there's another group. There are two major groups in Kenya.
Yeah.
The Kikuyus and the entrepreneurs. I believe that the Kikuyus are known as the intellectual people.
Okay.
Yes, I'm a bit familiar
Yeah.
with the story of Kenya, but forgive me, I still can't pronounce
Yes.
the names. yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I still can't pronounce the name, but you get the point.
Yes. Yeah. So that was so again in this what we're referring to is this article I wrote where I'm trying to draw from the literature some examples where authors really focus in on how the institutions differ, and then therefore the outcomes and infrastructure then are different as a result as well. So this is a paper that I think is particularly striking on this point and this issue. And there's always in infrastructure, there's always whenever a central actor makes a decision. So in the paper, I distinguish between local decisions about infrastructure versus national decisions. In the paper about Russia by Nafziger, that was a local government deciding about local infrastructure or local schools. Many settings, however, you have a central political actor making decisions about infrastructure throughout the economy. And in that kind of setting, there's naturally a possibility where those in power are going to target spending to particular areas for political purposes, right? And the people who are in those local areas are very happy to have that infrastructure because they're not paying for all of it, right? It's being paid by the society as a whole. So there's a very different political economy when you talk about central institutions making infrastructure decisions. And what we often think can happen is this targeting by those in power. So the question is targeting more severe in democracies versus autocracies? And the bottom line of this paper is they argue that targeting is more severe in autocracies because in this case, ethnic politics are being played. So an ethnic leader will direct spending to districts that have more of their co-ethnics. And they claim that in democracies, that type of ethnic targeting of spending, I guess, can be exposed more, right? And there would be punishments against politicians that did it, and that would then tend to deter such behavior. So that's a pretty big conclusion, I think, there that democracy could influence the degree of targeting, and so that's why I chose to highlight that paper.
Yeah, so this is a tangential point, but I made an
Yeah.
error earlier. I said that the Kikuyus were entrepreneurial, no, were intellectual. They are actually the entrepreneurial people, and the Luhus are the intellectuals.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
I don't,
not I'm not familiar with I'm no expert on Kenya, so I'll have to defer to you on that.
yeah, yeah.
So
I
the
studied.
contexts are quite interesting, though, aren't
Yes,
they? Right?
yes.
How this actually works on the ground.
I studied African history in school, so that's why I'm familiar with the history of Kenya. But when I'm speaking,
Yeah.
if I don't remember a point because I'm online, I just Google it because I'm not in the business of misinforming people. Yeah,
Understand.
yeah. So I just had to get that out of the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Dan, on the topic of infrastructure, some studies show a positive relationship between infrastructure and peace. So when we invest in infrastructure, employment should go up and crime should go down. But is this universal? In some parts of the developing world, for instance, infrastructure spending can lead to more crime because different groups are likely to fight over the distribution of resources. Is this a topic that you have written on or would be willing to study?
So your hypothesis that if there's with more infrastructure spending, there's more production and there's more value in the society, and therefore there might be more crime to sort of grab that surplus. Is
No,
that?
no,
I didn't
my
quite follow
thesis
the.
is that infrastructure spending can lower crime and create employment, but this causal relationship is not universal. In some places, it
Okay.
may accelerate crime because disparate groups are likely to fight over the authority to distribute resources.
So could it actually increase crime?
Yes.
What would be the argument of why it would increase crime?
All right. So let me give you an example. Again, I live in Jamaica in the
Okay.
Caribbean, and I'm directly referring to developing countries. So in a space where either the national state or the local state is weak, and there's an infrastructural development program, the resources are distributed along party lines or along tribal lines. And these developments are more likely to occur in the developing world. So I'm speaking from the position of someone who lives in a developing country who can share stories of infrastructure developments leading to crime because gangs are fighting over the money.
Okay, so you're saying the infrastructure spending is done along party lines.
Yes.
And so in areas that are outside the dominant political coalition or on the party out of power, people are angry in that area.
Yes.
And they might turn to crime as a result.
Yes, they fight over the resources. Dan, you're from a
That
rich
that's
country, so you wouldn't understand. You're from a rich country.
I no well yes, but I do study a lot of different places and time periods, and so it's not an unreasonable possibility. Um, so um, look, in these infrastructure projects do that earlier conversation we were talking about how they increase income. I said in that case, getting a Turnpike Trust raised income by 25%. You could ask yourself, what about the places that didn't get it? How do they feel about it, right? And a 25% difference in their income was a big deal. So it's very plausible to me, and I'm actually quite interested in this issue. Like, what about the losers in this process, or the people who maybe not lose, but who might fall behind, right? And don't get the infrastructure. I think it's entirely possible that they're going to react in all kinds of different ways to that loss, right? And I think crime would definitely be increased crime could be definitely an outcome of that. So I think that would be very interesting to learn more about.
Yes.
I think the key question there is to try to find places that are denied infrastructure. And maybe people get especially angry when they're systematically denied, because the situation you're talking about is not one where we say, oh, we ran out of money. People understand that they're not getting infrastructure because they're not part of the dominant party, right? That it's deliberate, it's systematic that they're not getting it. And that will generate resistance and anger and crime much more than, well, we just don't have enough money to spend, right?
Yes.
Even though politicians might use that justification, people understand how the politics work and that they're being denied. So that I think is a quite interesting thing, to try to go into settings where there's systematic differences in investment, and then looking at what happens in the places that don't get it. How do they react?
Yes, Jamaica represents a wellspring of evidence. So whenever you want to research a topic, you can read articles on Jamaica or visit. Let me give you some more examples. And this is along your
Okay.
research because they're interested in institutions.
Yep.
Institutions ought to impose constraints on leaders and bureaucrats. So in the context of a country like Jamaica, the institutions ought to be designed to ensure that bureaucrats are literally following the law, therefore it's harder for them to be corrupt. So in the United States, when some officials are being appointed, there's a big meeting in Congress and these people are vetted. In Jamaica, there might be a contract, there's a tender, the minister, the powerful person, his colleague gets the contract could be about 20 million, but the minister needs a cut, so the contract is inflated, it becomes 50 million. And then, in order for the workers to not be harassed, men in the inner city who are usually affiliated to gangs have to be paid. And there are several examples and studies on the topic, not unusual, but you live in a rich country.
No. So yeah, I think you're describing some deep truths about how less developed countries, what it's like on the ground with infrastructure, right? And I think it illustrates. So what's underlying this, right? There is not maybe a competitive political system. Maybe there's not an independent press to be able to expose this corruption. And so in those kind of conditions, you will have what you describe, where infrastructure is handed out to certain groups, a bunch of people get paid, and others pay for it, right? Through taxes. So yeah, I think you're making the point that really what's fundamental is how the society is organized, right?
And in Jamaica, the
Yeah,
problem is really enforcement, because
yeah,
Jamaica has been talking about anti-corruption measures for a long time, and laws have been passed to reduce corruption, but there's
okay,
an enforcement issue. People fear gangs and they fear political leaders. So even if the law is on paper, it may not be
yeah,
enforced.
right. So so many things there, right? One is about the power of the gangs, right? Um, they have almost kind of an independent power base. They can challenge anyone trying to enforce the law. So that's one feature of that system. I guess the other element would be the courts, right? If somebody is there's a law on the books, but if somebody isn't following the law, can the courts actually go and prosecute, right? It
Yes.
kind of comes down to that, right? Can the law really be enforced, as you say? So
Like,
those are really deep features of a society,
and
right?
are you going to take up my challenge and study Jamaica?
Okay. I'm always interested. Um, in fact, to be honest with you, I'm interested in more things than I have time to do.
Okay,
So
all right.
when you say to me, like based on this conversation, I would love to know more about Jamaica and try to understand what are like kind of the core issues. So yes, I am interested. Um, the the problem is time. So I should add to you at a place like UC Irvine, we have a lot of graduate students. And for someone in my position, often one of the things I can do is encourage graduate students to take up research. So I would say to anyone who's interested in learning more about Jamaica or similar topics, come study with me, and I'll help you. Using my expertise and training, I'll help you to understand what's going on, because one person can't research all these issues in the depth that's required.
All right then.
What's really
So,
needed is kind of a team. So come study with me.
also, you're telling me to come and study with you?
Yes.
And I agree. I will. Earlier today, I did a live video, and someone say, Lipton, maybe you should publish in X journal. And I said to the person, all right, publishing in a journal takes time and expertise. So if I were to publish in a journal, obviously I would write less opinionated pieces and interview people less. But it's something that I'm really interested in.
Well, it's good. I have had students in the past where they are very interested in policy issues and in disseminating kind of ideas about what's going on in different countries, but they wanted more of a technical training to be able to research some things at a deeper level. And so they studied with me, or got a PhD in economics or got an undergraduate degree in economics. So that's the path people can take when they're interested in real world issues, but they want a little bit more depth, right? but just to say, to really understand these issues, often it takes a PhD student or a new researcher who really devotes themselves to understanding a particular economy and what's going on. So that's why I was just saying, yeah, we need people to study these issues.
Yes, and that's why we all have goals. One of my long-term goals is to make a lot of money and start a research organization.
Okay.
I'm really interested in research, and we're going to study intelligence, the deep roots of economic development, and why institutional economics cannot explain policy in the developing world.
Okay. So can you give me an example of where you think institutional economics fails?
Failed in the developing world. So for example,
Yes.
I made reference to Jamaica. Jamaica, because of our relationship with the IDB, the World Bank, and the IMF, we have to do
Yep.
immense benchmarking. But when reports are published, the reports keep showing that institutional capacity is weak, even though the bureaucrats responsible for these projects are competent and express a high level of integrity. And I think the issue is culture. So let me explain more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Jamaica was once under British rule. And I'm fond of the British. I think that the British, they set the standard for institutional development, and on average, British colonies are superior. But during their tenure in Jamaica, the British did not care about the black majority. So the institutions that were built benefited the elite, and many of the British settlers, their children studied abroad. So after colonialism, Jamaica is now independent. The black population is suffering from low self-worth. They can evolve beyond slavery and colonialism, but the psychology has been deeply ingrained. So there was a point in Jamaican history when in Jamaica we refer to these people as brownings, people who are lighter in tone as brownings. So in the 50s and 60s, lighter people would work in banks and the governments. And as such, many of the elites tend to be lighter than average. So over time, the culture of low self-worth is ingrained in the country and in the population. And then there's
Right.
also the networking issue. So as a post-colonial society, success is based, sorry, let me recant a bit. Success is not necessarily based on luck or the people you know because we're post-colonial. I'm just saying, as a post-colonial society, success is based on luck and the people you know. So clientelism is a problem,
Right.
and in a space when people believe that the justice system is partial and that our institutions are partial and that our managers are biased, they're less inclined to be productive. So even if we
Right.
create the best institutions, there's the assumption that you're only going to be promoted if you know the boss or if you gossip with the boss. So Kenneth Carter wrote a book, Why Jamaicans Won't Work, and these are some of his conclusions. So it doesn't matter if we're building the best institutions. As Alicina told us years ago, when people ascribe success to luck, they're less likely to be productive in the long term.
Can I ask you? So what you say is really interesting. Can I ask you something about democracy and how it works in Jamaica? Do people feel like they can vote freely? Is so are elections handled in a transparent way? Is it a secret ballot? Are people's votes counted? That's one
Yeah, yeah.
question I have for you. And then the
Yeah.
second is, are there are there political parties that are competing with one another in Jamaica? And is the opposition to the party in power able to effectively criticize the party in power? How does democracy work?
All right, excellent question. So Jamaica is known for press freedom. So we get media freedom right. We're known for press freedom and we're also known for having a stable democracy. So despite high levels of tribalism and political violence in the past, democratic transitions are peaceful. Years ago,
Okay.
before I was born, the country is still tribal, but it was more tribal. So there were literally lines in communities across Jamaica, and one line would represent the PMP, another line the JLP. And if you were from the JLP side and you went over to the PMP side, you could be killed. But we have matured since then. But it's still tribal, but we have matured a bit. As for the political
So you would
parties,
say democracy works. The problem is that the democratic process. It's not that the democratic isn't working in Jamaica. You think it actually works well.
yeah, it works well. It's just that it's
Okay.
inefficient and corrupt. But it works.
It's just the decisions by the political actors are inefficient and corrupt.
Yes.
Not because of the way who has the franchise, how
Mm.
elections are run. You think that's fine?
Yeah, but it just
Okay.
it was actually really corrupt in the past, and that's why the Electoral Commission of Jamaica was created. But there was a point in Jamaica's history where people would literally stuff stuff a box with votes, so you didn't need to vote for the person. Some official would literally get votes and put it into a box, and I know people who said, "Yes, I've stuffed boxes for my party." Dead people used to vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, but that suggests you're saying that happened,
But
but you're
happened
saying not
in the
happening
past,
now.
yes, it was
Yes.
frequent in the
Okay. Got
past. It was really
it. Okay.
frequent. So we have matured a bit. But
So with that maturity in the democratic system, have you noticed any change in the behavior of the politicians? Maybe spending more on useful projects, or maybe has inflation been less?
also,
Anything of that
so
nature?
let me appraise our politicians properly. Politicians in Jamaica, like elsewhere, they do care about education. So they invest heavily in education. So I can't fault them for that. But the outcomes are ineffective due to the quality of training given to principals and senior managers. And this is why the National College for Educational Leadership was created to train principals. So politicians do spend heavily on education. The country is
Okay.
yet to reap value for money. We can always work on doing so. I think that teachers should be drawn from the top 10% or the top 30% of the graduating cohort, and we should do more to train specialist teachers. So a specialist for mathematics and a specialist for science, and many of these teachers are needed at the secondary level. Some of them are at the primary level. And there's also a plan to create STEM academies. I've been proposing this for a long time. But I won't fault the politicians for spending education. We're having an output problem, and this is linked to the family, dysfunctional families. Many of the youngsters were never raised by their father or their mother. They were basically like a wild beast. You're in the public space and you will observe children, usually boys, selling or gambling. They were never socialized properly, and as such, they resorted to crime. But priorities can be a bit misplaced. There is an agency called the Chase Fund, and the last time I checked, and I've written on the topic, the Chase Fund was more likely to spend money on sports than on education. And I take human capital seriously. And secondly, I am not a sports person. A developing country should know its priorities.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah,
Right.
but there was another problem again, is how the objectives of not resources, how the goals of organizations are aligned to the national economy. So we created a national training agency, the Heart Trust, around 42 years ago. And the Heart Trust should have trained business people, professionals, and technical workers. But because of the low quality of the education system, the Heart Trust has been spending billions on remedial programs. So the country is not really getting value for money. It's not that people at the heart are ineffective, but human capital is a serious problem. So they would prefer to divert more resources to the knowledge sectors, but so many people are not doing well. So they end up spending money
Right.
on remedial programs, and the remedial programs are not that successful because the cohort is poorly socialized. You can't take someone
Got it.
from the
Okay.
street and turn him in and turn this person into a model student overnight. And the heart is really designed to improve productivity, the productivity of people who already care about productivity. But today
Yeah.
it's really a socialization agency because people have to be socialized. So there are lots of issues.
So I see you. I see your argument here is that it goes basically to the culture, the society, the norms, particularly in youth. What kind of ideas are people forming about their life and how to behave? That's like really the fundamental problem. Sounds
Yes,
like
a
in
cultural
your
problem.
view.
And lastly, the
Yeah.
PMP represents the left, the JLP the right, but both parties exist because of the labor movement, and labor-based parties are usually socialist. So on paper, the JLP should be on the right, but its policies also reflect leftist sentiment. So basically, both parties are committed to social justice. Jamaica doesn't have a true conservative or libertarian party in the Western sense, and they like politicians like to pontificate about poor people and distribute resources. It's not a well created. It's not a wealth wealth oriented outlook. It's more welfare oriented.
Right. And
Yeah,
that's
but
interesting. That's
yes,
interesting.
but we have been speaking for some time, but unfortunately I have to wrap up, and maybe I should join you, Dan. I should join you.
Yes, come and study, and I would like to learn more from you, and I'd also like to help you develop your skill or help develop skills to do more. So yes,
All right,
I
bye.
would be interested in that. Okay, nice talking to you,
Yeah,
Lipton.
bye, Dan.